Good afternoon, and welcome to this afternoon's final daily press conference from number 6 Convent Place. There is a lot I need to tell you, so excuse me for launching straight into the reporting of today's figures. As at 900 hours on the 18th of May, we have carried out 5,187 tests for COVID-19 in Gibraltar. That represents over 16% of the resident population. We are now only awaiting 9 outstanding results. The number of confirmed cases remains 147. There have been no new cases identified. The number of active cases is therefore still now only 2. Both are well. Today, there are no new COVID cases and there are no COVID cases in our hospitals. That means no COVID in John Ward and no COVID in the ICU. As from tomorrow, we will publish updated figures at midday each day on our social media, and we will share those figures with the established media ahead of that embargoed to midday. Also, as from tomorrow, the Gib Telecom text that every subscriber to Gib Telecom services receives in Gibraltar will carry a new line which will set out the number of persons self-isolating at home as a result of the symptoms of COVID-19. Today, that figure is 39. The texts will no longer be sent on weekends or bank holidays. But we will be ensuring that everyone who is self-isolating is tested as soon as possible as part of the test, trace and isolate procedure. When it comes to self-isolating, we're also conscious of the number of people who are self-isolating not because they have the virus or are awaiting a test. We're aware of those self-isolating because they are greatly immunosuppressed. We will therefore shortly be updating our advice on shielding, given the very low numbers of COVID-19 positive individuals in our community. So Gibraltar ends phase 1 of the Unlock the Rock strategy with no new cases of COVID and with no deaths since the major incident was declared. A remarkable achievement for which I thank all the men and women in our frontline agencies, the Public Health Gibraltar staff, the GHA and our law enforcement agencies. It is against that backdrop that the Cabinet met this morning. In consideration of the figures that were put before us, the Cabinet agreed unanimously to move forward into phase 2 of the process of unlocking. I want to tell you more about what that means for the next 14 days. First of all, as from 00 hours on Friday morning, the Cabinet has agreed that the regulations which provide restrictions on the freedom of movement of persons of all ages will not be renewed. The lockdown regulations expire at midnight this coming Thursday. That means that as from Friday, the 22nd of May, they will no longer operate. Until then, all the restrictions continue to apply. Therefore, or rather thereafter, it will continue to be our advice that you should stay at home, but it will not be the law that you should stay at home. We are moving from rules restricting mobility that are compulsory to rules of social distancing which are advisory. We're working to see how additional aspects of the unlocking can be undertaken safely during this period and in line with the current lockdown regulations. We will today publish an amendment to the regulations that relate to businesses to enable gyms and personal trainers to resume business. But for now at least, the operation of gyms must be done in a different way and in accordance to public health advice and its permissions to ensure safety. For the time being, gymnasiums and trainers may only operate indoors if they are in possession of a permit from the Director of Public Health. There is an application process for such permits via the Office of Civil Contingencies by email at fitnesspermits@gibraltar.gov.gi. The Director of Public Health will also today publish guidelines for gymnasiums and personal trainers to assist them in such applications, and applicants will be required to submit an outline of what protocols will be put in place in order to comply with the guidelines. Applications will be considered and permits will only be granted where the Director of Public Health is satisfied that the risk of infection has been minimised. A virtual meeting with the Director of Public Health so that he may explain these guidelines to those gymnasiums wishing to attend has been arranged by the Office of Civil Contingencies to take place at 6:30 p.m. today. In addition, gymnasiums and trainers will be required to keep a daily list of all the people who have attended their premises for the safety of their members. The purpose of this is so that in the event of someone who has attended a gym testing positive for COVID-19, the information of who may have come into contact with them at the gym can be easily obtained. The information will of course be subject to very strict data protection safeguards and can only be shared for contact tracing purposes in the extent of a positive case at a gym, when gyms will only be required to keep the daily information for this purpose for a maximum of 10 days. Equally, for data protection purposes, the establishment will only be informed that someone who has attended has tested positive, and the identity of the individual will not be revealed. Public transport will now also start to return slowly. As it does, we will be updating advice on routes and frequency. We're looking to finalise public health advice on this. At the moment, we believe we will be requiring the compulsory use of face coverings or masks on public transport. We will initially be providing the masks from the time that these are required. Again, this may change as the prevalence of the virus in our community changes. Public transport will be a hugely important part of how we reduce pollution going forwards as we progress the closure of Linewall Road and the introduction of more parking fees to persuade people to stay out of their cars. We will only be a better city at the end of this process as a result. Trust us on this, just as you trusted us on lockdown. Trust us to deliver a friendlier, greener Gibraltar. I want to move now to an operation which took place today at our port. Gibraltar took part in the repatriation of crew members from 2 vessels this morning, the Sovereign and the Jewel of the Seas. In a well-coordinated plan involving the Gibraltar Port Authority, the Gibraltar Airport, in-cargo shipping services and various transport companies, over 320 passengers were transferred to the air terminal, observing all the directions given by the Director of Public Health. 2 chartered British Airways flights, which flew in yesterday, were intending to carry these passengers to London Heathrow, where they would then catch another chartered flight to Barbados. One of the flights, with 164 crewmen, departed on time, but unfortunately the other flight, which had 154 crewmen on board, has had a technical issue which has resulted in it requiring a wheel to be changed. This has meant that the second set of passengers will not reach London Heathrow in time to catch the flight to Barbados. Crew members at the air terminal have returned to the 2 vessels, which have remained in port, waiting until the flights have departed, as is required under the COVID protocol issued by the Gibraltar Port Authority. It is expected that the aircraft will be ready to take the 154 crewmen to London tomorrow morning. The 2 vessels will remain alongside until the crewmen are taken to the airport and the aircraft departs. This is important economic activity for our future work as we emerge from the public health emergency. In that respect, this Friday I will host a further meeting of CELAC. In that meeting, we will be looking at many of the issues facing businesses as we go into the next phases of unlocking. We will also look at what happens if we identify new clusters and we need to stamp on them. What happens when people identify as having symptoms? What happens to their work on that day? What happens to employees whilst they're being tested? And what happens to holiday pay this year, when some employees may have spent a quarter of the year at home already paid, and in some cases arguably paid more than they are even paid at work, given that beat payments did not suffer deductions of social insurance or PAYE in April. Those are key issues, as well as the issues that ministers leading our Restart and Recover and our future task forces are bringing up for discussion. I also want to thank the many in local business who are sending us ideas for this CELAC discussion. These discussions will be reflected in a document that will be part 2 of our Unlock the Rock series. That document will be published on or about the 1st of July to set out in good time our view on how things will progress beyond the 1st of August. Thank you now to all the journalists who played a part in these press conferences. GBC for their live coverage and the back catalogue that we've enjoyed on both sides of the press conferences each day. The Chronicle and Panorama for their deliveries of their newspapers to the elderly in our community. To YGTV for continuing to ensure that we're up to date online, and to the Olive Press for reporting our message beyond Gibraltar. And to all of them for their questions at this sensitive time in our democracy. You really have been the fourth estate. Thank you also to the depleted staff of our press office for being here on shift every day to make these conferences a reality. Thank you also to all those of you at home. Thank you for watching. We promised you 8 weeks ago that you would get all the information you needed from us, and you have. But thank you all particularly for following our advice. Together, we have delivered the results that we have seen today. Let's do what we need to do to keep the figures down by observing the rules of hygiene and of social distancing. Let's win every round against this virus. Together, you know we can. So thank you very much indeed for having watched until now. And this is a final opportunity for journalists to ask a question in this daily press conference. Over to GBC first.
Chief Minister, there was a press release issued by No More Shame today regarding the increased rates of Gibraltarian women calling helplines, women who don't have access to safe abortions because, as No More Shame is saying, for the first time in 40 years, there's no access to safe abortions anywhere, including Spain. Now, I wanted to ask you, has there been any discussion or thought given to the referendum, which was, I was going to say aborted, but perhaps that's not the right word, cancelled or postponed last March?
So if you look at the statement I made when we went into the process of unlocking, I specifically said that the Parliament would be considering not just the normal issues that Parliament considers when it gets together, the legislation that is before us, in particular the legislation on insolvency and taking questions, but also the return of the select committees and when we would set the referendum on abortion for. So that's a live issue for Parliament when we meet again at the end of this month. I think it's on the 28th of this month. I've today received a communication from No More Shame, which I haven't yet been able to address directly, but I haven't seen their press release. I'm grateful for you pointing this issue out. It is, of course, an issue that needs to be considered in the context of the culmination of the debate, which has been on foot now for some time and which will reach a conclusion once that referendum is held and the results are announced. But you're right to point out, or at least No More Shame are right to point out, that this is a first time when we've seen an extended period of frontier closure in circumstances where people who wish to have abortions or need to have abortions will not be able to access them in Spain in the way that was considered might be the case if Brexit were to happen with a frontier which was very difficult or impossible to permeate. And so this makes that issue a very live issue, but I don't want to comment further from this particular pulpit on this particular occasion. Christina?
From the Chronicle, is there any update on the request to be exempt from the UK's 14-day quarantine period? And in regards to the situation at the border, I believe in an interview with Spanish media you suggested there could be a return to normality around mid-June. Is that the case?
So remember that on the second I was speculating, and I specifically said I was speculating. On the first, it's important that we note that there have been developments in the past 48 hours in the United Kingdom where what appeared to be an exception agreed with France is no longer necessarily as had been set out by the French embassy in London in the immediate aftermath of the Prime Minister's address to the nation 8 days ago. So the fact that France might be somehow excluded from the operation of the quarantine raised an important issue of discrimination. We need to see how that settles before we are able to understand how the issue of quarantine will or will not affect Gibraltar in the context of arrivals into the United Kingdom. And in the context of free movement with Spain, I mean, a lot will turn on how Spain addresses its own internal movement rules. At the moment, there are different provinces and different parts of the autonomous regions of Spain going through different phases of unlocking. So I think that we need to see how that develops in the next 7 days. They have phases which change every 7 days before considering free movement into and out of Spain for those who are not coming into Gibraltar or going into Spain for reasons which are already provided for in the Real Decreto, which are published in the Boletín Oficial del Estado.
Chief Minister, how do you, looking back over the last 2 months, more or less, since the crisis first started, I mean, have you been, what do you think have been the biggest challenges that you've faced? And in terms of like now, as we wind down out of lockdown, what have you learned that you can take going forward?
So I think if you want to understand what the past 60-odd days have been like, you have to put yourself in the position that we were in, which we did not hide from the public when we were advised that we would have potentially hundreds of deaths of Gibraltarians. At one stage, some of the numbers we were looking at might have gone as high as 3,000 people. In some instances, they went into the several hundreds of people. And the period during which that might happen was a very short period. So we were looking at potentially hundreds of deaths in a period of 8 to 12 weeks. You have to understand what that does to you. This is literally to stare into the abyss. In the context of Gibraltar, that's us losing 10% of our population. 10% of our population. I mean, if that sounds exaggerated, just remind yourself that the United Kingdom has lost the entire population of Gibraltar already in 5 weeks. And plus more. Now they're at 36,000 dead. Spain has lost the entire adult population of Gibraltar in 5 weeks. That's the sort of abyss into which we stared. And I stared into that abyss with my cabinet colleagues, with the advice of Public Health Gibraltar and with the advice of the GHA on what to do. And I shared those statistics, not just with the public, but initially also with the leader of the opposition. And we looked together into what that future could mean. I don't think it's possible, even now as I recount it, to explain what it was that the cabinet was facing. I mean, we were establishing niches in the cemetery, not because we just felt like it, or because we wanted to scare people, but because it was our obligation to have in place a contingency to deal with that number of dead bodies. Now, was that a gross exaggeration, which didn't require this level of activity? In my view, again referring you to the position in the United Kingdom, in Spain, in all of the developed economies around us, and indeed now in the United States of America, is that that is what we were actually looking at if we did not take the steps to lock down. If we had simply allowed the virus into Gibraltar, given the demographics of Gibraltar and how we live, it's very likely it would have spread very easily. If we had allowed this into our elderly residential facilities, if we'd allowed it into the facilities that we run as a government for elderly tenants, like Seamaster Lodge, Charles Brisson House, Albert Riso, etc., and Bishop Canilla House, we would have seen this virus do its worst. I wasn't prepared not to take the steps necessary. None of my ministers were prepared not to take the steps necessary. The opposition were not prepared not to take the steps necessary together to do everything we could to make those predictions an exaggeration which never came true. And I'm very pleased that we had the advice that we had, which made us stare into the abyss, which made us take the steps that we took, both to ensure that that didn't happen and to be ready in the event that it did happen. I mean, it seems quite surreal to me that we're sitting where we're sitting today, with the numbers that we're seeing today, with the virus almost extinguished in our community, no new cases in the past 6 days. I mean, it is frankly remarkable. This is joint work, right? And we are very lucky to find ourselves where we find ourselves today. But I ask people to reflect with me and look backwards at where we were. It would be very difficult at any time to impose restrictions on people's constitutional freedoms, and yet it was easy. It was easy because it was necessary and because people understood that it was necessary. I mean, many generations of struggle led to us to have complete control over the geography of Gibraltar and our freedom to roam around it as we wish. And yet, overnight, we extinguished that for ourselves. It's the first time in the modern history of Gibraltar, indeed, it's the first time in the British history of Gibraltar, that the civilian government of Gibraltar has restricted the movement of the civilian population in and around Gibraltar. We've been restricted before by the military, at times of war, times of conflict, at times of they just wanted to. For a parade, we might be prevented from doing one thing or another. This is the first time in our history that the civilian government of Gibraltar, the civilian authorities of Gibraltar, restricted the movement of civilians in Gibraltar. And civilians understood that and cooperated for very good reason. And so I think it is absolutely right, as we reflect on this moment in our history, that we don't allow ourselves to forget now. And today I can feel a lot of normality. I mean, my emails are reflecting a lot of the old issues today, not these key issues. But let us not forget where we were and what we have been through together. and let us not let go of the emotions that pushed us to work so closely together and to deliver this magnificent result together. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Minister. I'm going to read out a question from Your Gibraltar TV. They've been contacted by a concerned parent who is asking if the government is considering making special arrangements to enable beach access for disabled members of the community this summer, especially as the use of beaches will be subject to more restrictions this year.
Thank you. It's actually something I specifically already dealt with in one of my earlier press conferences. I said that at the same time as we were dealing with the over 70-year-olds and their potential needs during the course of the bathing season, we were specifically already committed to looking at these issues for those who suffer from disabilities of all ages. So already this issue has been specifically addressed by me in a press conference. It has been specifically provided for in a cabinet discussion, and it is being specifically worked on. So they should have no concerns whatsoever, and I'm happy to repeat that. GBC?
Regarding the reopening of restaurants, something that occurred to us in discussion earlier on today is there are a lot of restaurants that are hybrid establishments. They're restaurants, but they're also bars with open areas, etc. Is there going to be a curfew when it comes to, because restaurants are opening at 50% capacity? So is there going to be a curfew that prohibits a restaurant from then turning into a nightclub or a scenario type thing? You know what I mean?
So there's definitely going to be a curfew prohibiting the operation of restaurants as nightclubs, because as you've seen in our Unlock the Rock document, the provision in relation to nightclubs is that they will not be able to reopen for now, because there's no concept of social distancing in a nightclub. Indeed, and you might argue that you go to a nightclub to ensure that you are allowed not to social distance by somebody who you might meet there. So I think the important thing, however, is to distinguish that from how restaurants are able to operate. And what you want to do is to enable restaurants, if necessary, to operate for longer, but as restaurants that might open a little later, that might open a little earlier and might close a little later, but not in any way transform themselves into nightclubs simply because of the time of night. Now, we've got to be logical about this, right? Now, potentially, one of the things we do as we slowly reintroduce restaurants is they operate on a period of restricted hours. And that makes sense because we need to ensure that we're monitoring what happens when we reopen restaurants. But once you're happy that restaurants are operating in those particular restricted hours in a way that does not give rise to the transmission of the virus, you then allow the restaurants to operate for longer hours, perhaps longer hours than you used to allow before, so that they can operate for longer, so that that 50% gets as close as possible to what their 100% might have been. Extraordinarily complex, and it's not going to be my job, it's going to be somebody else's job to make those assessments, but that's what I've been told, and that's how it's going to be run. Christina.
In a similar vein to John's question, I'm just wondering what this experience has been like for you personally and for your team to have to lead this community through this crisis. There must have been quite some low points.
Well, yeah, you can imagine there were some low points, and I can tell you that that my team upstairs, my outer office, and my ministerial team has not worked less than ever, as has been the case in for many people, because the government has enforced that. I'm not suggesting that people have not wished to go to work. The government has closed down their places of work. But look, we found ourselves working not less but more. I mean, we've been in here just about every weekend. We've been in here throughout the period of lockdown. We haven't been staying at home. We've been required to be at our desks. It has been absolutely the most difficult thing that I have ever gone through at a personal level. I can tell you that my academic trajectory is such that I've had to do a lot of academic work in a very short period of time. My legal trajectory is such that, as any lawyer will tell you, when you have deadlines to go to a court or a transaction, you work 24, 48 hours. Brexit was, I thought, difficult. But this has been undoubtedly the most difficult thing I have ever done. And I've got ministers who've been through a lot, and I know that this is undoubtedly the thing that has been the hardest for them to do. You cannot pretend to imagine what it's like to look at the possibility that you're going to lose 3,000 Gibraltarians. I mean, just please pause and reflect. That's 10% of our population. I mean, what do we do if we emerge out of this having lost 10% of our population? And, as people sometimes know, I have no ability to control my emotions in some instances, and it would have been very difficult for me not to wear my heart on my sleeve if I was reporting to you today that we had lost that number of Gibraltarians. The work we have done has avoided that. Not the work that we have done, the work that we have done together has avoided that. And so I'm left with the stark fear of facing that potential loss of my fellow Gibraltarians, which I say almost as if it wouldn't have affected me. I mean, I could have been one of them with a BMI index of 32. It now turns out I might have been one of those on the slab. It's that serious. I mean, let's face reality, because you don't pay me to avoid the reality of what we're dealing with. And I said that these press conferences were about telling the truth. And at the same time, the elation of being able to sit here today and to say, we stopped this at the gate. 147 is really a cluster. This was never a wave, yeah? I remember coming back on that plane from London, having met Boris Johnson, having done a lot of the Brexit work, determined that I was going to sit down in that cabinet meeting and I was going to close those bars and I was going to close those restaurants, because I could fear what would happen with the virus then rife, it running around, and I could not imagine anything more important than that weekend having the meetings of the cabinet to lead to the restrictions on the freedom of movement, and by the end of that following week having really shut down Gibraltar completely. I was very, very determined to achieve that. I had a ministerial team who understood the importance of that, determined to achieve it with me. I had the benefit of the medical advice that was telling us that there was good reason to derogate from the constitutional freedoms on the basis of public health, which is what they provide for. And I had the legal advice of the Attorney General telling me that that would be proportionate. And I had the political support of the leader of the opposition in those circumstances. So, fear, tactic, strategy, elation because of success. Those are the roller coaster of emotions that politics teaches you is possible.
Chief Minister, considering that amazing amount of emotion and that difficulty, I think, that we've all suffered in order to overcome this challenge, how hard is it for you now to see on social media some of these comments saying of people who want to defy the social distance and return to normality? Is that frustrating for you, considering the sacrifice we have made already?
No, it's not frustrating. Look, I perfectly understand that we are social animals and that what we have to do is control ourselves so that we can move to that stage sooner. But the stage at which we move is not now. We have to understand that we are still potentially in the grip of this virus if we haven't obliterated the final instance of it, and it can come through our frontier, and we may then need to stamp down on it. So this is what we have to do. I mean, when I was in the middle of dealing with this at the beginning, I made a very impassioned position known of what I thought of people who were then defying the position that the government was setting out and gathering. Look, I can't complain that people want to get together and want to be close. It's in the nature of human relations, but I can tell you that I think it's very selfish not to appreciate the sacrifice that we've all made, that some people are still making. The immunosuppressed are still at home, the over 70s are still being advised to stay at home, the law is still there. So I think we have to understand how important it is not to throw away the effort that we have been through. At the same time, I must tell you that I think that there are comments on social media which are gross exaggeration. And, today is the 18th of May. When we first unlocked on the 2nd of May, there were photographs of Main Street where people were going about their business, actually following the rules of social distancing, and a video from GBC was a very good depiction of the fact that people were moving and following the rules of social distancing, but some photographs taken from particular angles suggested that they might be closer together. And there were people in the beaches also following the rules of social distancing, but perhaps being photographed as being slightly close together. And there were naysayers on social media. Oh, woe is me. 14 days from now, we'll all have it. The government has been wrong to somehow slightly unlock. Look, the government was acting on the basis of public health advice. That given where the numbers were, if we unlocked as we were proposing to unlock, we would not have the return of a cluster 14 days later. Although we wouldn't do more until 21 days later in order to be able to observe what happened 14 to 17 days later. The cluster's not there. So, look, social media is many things which fill us with joy. It's the opportunity for families to stay united if they are at great distance, to be able to see to them, each other, etc. It's also a place for the most horrendous gossip and the most opinionated to give the worst of themselves. No. We take the good with the bad, but let's be clear. Shall we go back and see what the people who are today saying some of the things that you're talking about were saying 16 days ago? Because they might be as wrong now as they were 16 days ago. They never remind us of the things they said before, which turn out to be wrong. They just give us the benefit of their new, unfiltered opinion. Well, frankly, I think it's important that we continue on the course of doing what people have elected us to do, which is to take the proper advice in the field of public health in particular, now that we're dealing with a public health problem, to take proper advice in all other areas and to act upon that proper advice for the vast majority of Gibraltarians. That's what they want to see us do. They don't want to see us react to comments on social media.
Thank you, Chief. I'm going to read out our final question today from Your Gibraltar TV from home. How does the government plan to continue feeding relevant information to the public now that the daily briefings will end? Is there a danger that without this daily engagement on social media and via TV, that the important messages about social distancing, reporting symptoms, and different unlocking phases will slip from the public's attention?
So obviously we don't think so. Otherwise we wouldn't be ending the press conferences. I think the press conferences have now run their course. I mean, we have tried to make them as informative as possible, not just about the numbers, not just about the new rules, but also about what's happening in the background in different areas. But I think it is also true to say that people are seeing members of the government come out every day and give them the advice and then tell them what we're doing, etc. And I think the usefulness of a live broadcast providing detail and information is now being not as generously received or indeed required as much as it was. And so therefore, look, we're ready to come back if necessary. But at the moment, I think that we have a population that is known for its common sense. The vast majority have complied with the rules of only having to be told once. They don't need to have things repeated to them and repeated to them. And I sincerely believe that it's not going to be a problem of people forgetting the rules of social distancing, although each of us will perhaps get closer to a friend or relative in the street that we might have to, and we might have to be reminded by them, or we might have to remind ourselves. That's just human nature. There's one thing that we will never be able to legislate against, we'll never be able to remind you not to do, we'll never be able to push you against. It's human nature and common sense. And there ain't no police officer that's going to be responsible for that. There ain't no press conference that's going to persuade you not to act in keeping with your human nature. So, I sincerely believe that we will be able to get you the information that you need in the mechanism that we're going to put in place. We'll always be available for press conferences when we need them. We'll convene them when we think we have to. Otherwise, I hope this is the beginning of this process just becoming a nightmare that we all forget.
Thank you, Chief Minister. No further questions today.
Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you for being with us at number 6 Common Place. All of the days that you have been with us since we started this process in mid-March. It has been that roller coaster, not just for me and for my ministers, but also for you, I know. And I sincerely hope that Gibraltar will once again be known as the place that is blessed in the way that it's dealt with coronavirus, as we have with so many challenges in the past. I asked a friend during the course of the Jewish Feast of Passover that they pray that Gibraltar might recall coronavirus in the same way as the Jewish people remember the passing of the plague in Egypt as it having passed over Gibraltar. For now it has. Let's keep fighting to ensure it will.